thanks very much, Debbie. I'm really glad to be here and inspired so far. I think I'm going to give a short presentation, or at least I hope it's short. Preparing these slides, I did a Google search on planetary boundaries for news, and up came this website. Last week. This is the UNDP website. This is the headline: Education, Healthcare, Honest Government and Jobs, top priorities for people worldwide. Basically what happened was the UNDP did some form of consultation and survey of over 1 million people around the world to see what they thought about the priorities for post-2015 agenda. And what's really interesting to me is that in the one-sentence synthesis on the UNDP website, planetary boundaries is absolutely there. In a sense, the Kay Grayworth's thinking about having to live within planetary boundaries was ensuring that the things that we all want in different ways can still be achieved. So that's quite a remarkable situation in a way for it seems to me, for the concept so far. Why I'm interested in the concept is because it's a new framing for sustainability, and I think, and this is why I think it's really why I'm not surprised, Jakob, that there's such difficulty with the SDGs and this whole idea of integration. It's fundamentally different. The planetary boundaries concept is fundamentally different to sustainability. It's no longer this, I would say, dishonest idea of a balance between economy, society and environment. But it is actually, it's about the Earth system processes, ESP, if you like, giving us the framework for our social existence. And the economy is there as a social construct to help us have the good things and the good lives that we need and that we want. And so it's not this, it's in my view, sustainable development as an idea is, of course, it's always going to be there, but it's part of the problem. So the really interesting thing for me about the concept is that it's a new framing. So what am I going to talk about? The aims of according to the website of the symposium, are to look at the challenges for legal governance, the key actors to influence, and what types of legal advocacy analysis. I'm going to do 2 of those things just to kind of get some discussions going, hopefully, about these. What are the challenges for legal governments? I think there's loads of challenges, of course, but the external preconditions, and I think I've just chosen 2 here. And I've said to knock sustainable development off its perch. I've put those dots in brackets afterwards because, of course, sustainability is going to be around. It's too embedded, but it's going to have to operate at a lower perch. It cannot be the framing anymore. It just isn't going to work. I think it's also necessary to restore belief in international law. I think as a lawyer, I think at the moment the whole political environment, as we saw at Rio, the failure to have legal binding commitments compared to 20 years ago. The whole current environment is against international legal obligations, and I'm believing that the rule of international law is important. And obviously I believe that. I think we're not going to have any new laws on planetary boundaries without a belief in these things at the international level. In terms of legal advocacy analysis, I think that we need to imagine, as I say, imagine and propose the institutions, and imagine and propose the necessary instruments, the legal instruments, where they are necessary. I agree they're not always necessary, of course not, but they will be necessary, or amendments to existing issues. But also to consider the current legal mechanisms, what's out there already that civil society can start to use and to push for this kind of thinking. In terms of the problem with the institutions is that we don't have at the moment any conceptually congruent institution, an institution that is congruent conceptually to the planetary boundaries idea. UNEP, of course, is in the environment silo, deep down there within the sustainable development concept. If we had a World Environment Organization, it would be stronger functionally, but it still would be in the environment silo. The CSD, if you like, the Commission for Sustainable Development, is going to be abolished, I think, next week. After 20 years, again, conceptually incongruent. We do have what we have now in terms of the institutions, as I say, a panel, a forum, a future report, and a board and a group. Now, I think we're going to play with these kinds of ideas. The Global Sustainability Panel, which is an ex-panel now, it is no more, but that was the one of all these 5 or 6 I put up here, that was the one that actually, if I would say, got the planetary boundaries concept. That is no more. We have the new forum, the high-level political forum after Rio +20. That's going to be inaugurated next week, as we say goodbye to the CSD. But of course, they're still in the SD mode of thinking, and they'll go forward as Jakob has said. Interestingly, we're going to have, and this is a new thing, we're going to have, and it comes out, a Global Sustainable Development Report for 2013. Now that's new, and that's, if you like, the nearest we've got to the State of the Planet report idea that was in the original zero draft of the outcome document for Rio. So it's progress. We're starting finally to get this idea that we need to have some overview of the planet, as an Earth system, not as an environmental program down here. There are also some other interesting institutions, I think, the board and the group. I think that the chief executive's board for coordination, there's about 39 CEOs of all the UN agencies who get together, and we have a look at, they're particularly their high-level committee on programs, which is chaired at the moment by Achim Steiner, I believe, and they've got 2 main functions, and it seems to me that this is where we need to be influencing at this level system-wide follow-up of UN decisions, but also the scanning and identifying of emerging program issues that require a system-wide response. So I think if you like, there is something there at a UN level that we need to work with what we've got there. And there's also the UN Development Group, which is more about helping countries meet commitments within at a country level around the international. In terms of instruments and principles, as I say, I put up here, I'm not going to go through the draft declaration, but we worked hard on trying to synthesize this as succinctly as we could. The first principle, and came down up with this idea of principles of recognition, respect and responsibility, and they all lead through, if you like, and with their different legal and policy implications if we accept those principles. I mentioned there the ecological integrity principle, which we will hear from later on, as, if you like, what I think of as a sort of black letter law thinking to try and take these things forward in terms of legal principles, as opposed to, if you like, policy or advocacy principles. But I also think it's important to look at objectives of legal instruments. And I was interested, Sarah, I was interested in the report that you did, Sarah, on the Swedish, for the Swedish EPA, on how could you apply planetary boundaries on a national level, which was, I really loved reading that. And and this bit is I think it's really good to look at how particular targets and commitments are matching up, as it were, to where there are international environmental agreements. But I think it's also important to look at the objectives of the conventions, because I think if we don't get the objectives of the conventions right, then everything else has got to flow from that. And I think the problem with the CBD Convention, biodiversity, is that it's indiscriminate in its idea of conservation, use and sharing of benefits being together. It has to be sequential, it seems to me, if we're going to be true to the planetary boundary concept. But we also need to look beyond MEAs, and I think, and this is what here, I've just put this up because it's a really interesting point about the World Bank, for example, where we need to look at these are the purposes of the World Bank, and we have to say, well, if these are the legal purposes, you want the World Bank to take planetary boundaries on board. You come to the lawyer, you want them to do something. They say, well, you don't have to do it. This is what the purposes of the bank are legally. These 5 purposes, and you see there's no reference whatsoever to any environmental or social issues. It's all about capital for investment, and private foreign investment, balance of payments, etc. And there's another article in the World Bank Constitution as well, which actually spells it out. Only economic considerations shall be relevant to their decisions. So for as long as we've got those legal framing documents in our main institutions, we're never going to get to anywhere near respect for planetary boundaries. So, but I also noticed, I just mentioned it there for UK people, Section 11 of the International Development Act actually means that the House of Commons must approve World Bank funding, not only World Bank, but multilateral funding. And so there might be an interesting campaigning mechanism there for, as we need House of Commons action. Current mechanisms, I think more and more I've become convinced that human rights is the legal mechanism, that it's short of sitting down and drafting legal documents and new conventions and amending here and amending there, which is also needs to be done. What can we do now, where if we're not the government, if we are civil society, and we want to see action around planetary boundaries? And I think the human rights mechanism, more and more, seems to be coming to its to a kind of fruition. Over 20 years, it's been going for a long time. Remember, 20 years ago, I was employed by Michael Anderson, who's now David Cameron's special representative on the post-2015. But Michael Anderson was at SOAS, School of Oriental African Studies, and I got employed to organise a conference on human rights and the environment. And he with Alan Boyle, then published the legal book on it, Human Rights Approaches to Environmental Protection. And there it really was 20 years ago a sort of wacky idea. It was really, really slow. But we'll see, it's really coming stronger and stronger to be accepted that there is an environmental human right. And I think that not only just purely in terms of environment, but also in terms of, if you like, the underlying determinants of health and social well-being. And that's why I think we must start looking at the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. I think there's some good, let's say, PB-friendly stuff around Articles 11 and 12 on an adequate standard of living, right to water, right to health. The general comments have very, very helpful information on, if you like, how important environmental conditions are for adequate standards of living and for health. We now have an optional protocol. Let's just nip down to the optional protocol. This came into force in May. And this is basically the right for individuals to make complaints to the committee under the convention. It's the first time that this has become possible. I've listed there those who have basically signed up to it, and I've listed the European countries there, Portugal and Spain. You could now, in fact, use this against Portugal if you're Portuguese, or if you're Spanish. If you're under the jurisdiction of Portugal or Spain, for example, you could start to use this optional protocol. There are also another number of European countries who've signed but haven't ratified. But it's also interesting as well, it seems that you don't have to show a clear disadvantage, so long as you show the communication raises a serious issue of general importance. So I think there is some scope here for some creative thinking about that. I'm just going backwards, I'll come back to this. But obviously there are other legal possibilities as well. National institutions, I think we should start looking at our national human rights institutions to see to what extent they're taking planetary boundaries on board. There's a web link there to the Scottish Human Rights Commission, which is a fantastic page on their website, I must say. And of course there's some other committees as well that are possible, but in the usual way of right to life and things that we're used to doing. But perhaps I'm trying to think here about how can you broaden it out in terms of legal actions. European Social Charter, we forget about that. As UK lawyers, we tend to think, oh well, because the major government didn't want the European Social Charter, Blair didn't want it, and we didn't sign up to it. But actually, recently earlier this year, Greece was found guilty, if you like, violation of right to health because of environmental pollution on the basis of the 1961 Charter. And we did sign the 1961 Charter in the days when we had a consensus where that these things were good ideas. So maybe there is some possibility there of something under that. But I think what's really interesting, and this is where I think now we have to think, is this whole idea of extraterritorial obligations on states in terms of human rights. This is really, of course, has been one of the problems, if you like. But what's interesting is that the Maastricht Principles, which were a group of 40 experts 2 years ago, at the same time we were coming up with our declaration, they came up with the Maastricht Principles, which they say is actually clarify the content of extraterritorial state obligations. And the interesting one with the statement, so it's a kind of statement, obviously it's pushing, in their view, the law as far as it can go. But this is what they came up with, that states must desist from acts and omissions that create a real risk of nullifying or impairing the enjoyment of health, water, adequate standard of living, extraterritorial. Now that seems to me to be absolutely tailor-made for planetary boundaries. Can we use that idea? Yes, I think perhaps we can, and this is where I'm going to finish. The environment is rising up the Human Rights Council agenda. That's why I'm thinking after 20 years, well, finally something's moving. They did an interesting analytical study on the relationship at the end of 2011. They appointed John Knox as an independent expert on human rights and environment for 3 years in 2012, and his first report came out in 2012. So we're going to get something, and this is why I mean, copy and paste any of it really, but I just thought it's worth, he's raised absolutely in there the issue of extraterritoriality of human rights obligations, and particularly in the light of the, as he calls, the number and intensity of the environmental threats that we're now feeling. So I think that I think there's hope there if we can focus in terms of using current mechanisms on the human rights legal track.